Hi, welcome to this webinar. And my name is Eva Maria Lisiak. I'm a permaculture designer consultant, and welcome. Today, you will get to know an alternative way of growing food. This is the agenda for today. So, I will give you an introduction to permaculture. I will provide definition and a brief history. Then, we will move on to principles. I will outline 5 global problems and how permaculture provides a solution to them. Okay, so let's get started. So I will read the definition of permaculture and then we will discuss. So feel free to post any comments during this presentation. I would love to hear about you and why did you decide to join this webinar. Okay, so permaculture is a holistic approach to designing sustainable human habitats. And it is based on the principles of ecology, and it aims to create systems that are self sustaining, resilient, and most importantly, regenerative. I think the easiest way to explain this is by comparing permaculture to a modern agricultural system. So, the modern agricultural system is based on a monoculture. So it is a practice of growing a single crop over a large area of land. And typically, this approach is heavily dependent on the use of synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and fossil fuels to increase crop yields and control pests. Um, and the focus of modern agriculture is often to maximize production, often at the expense of nature, rather than creating a sustainable and self sustaining ecosystem. So, on this slide, you can see 2 pictures. On the left, we have a beautiful garden with lots of flowers and collards, and I can see amaranth flower there. Beautiful marigolds. For those of you who maybe have grown with the concept of doing weeding and like seeing the soil, this might look a bit strange to you that you don't see the soil. But in permaculture, we aim to diminish the effect of evaporation and conserve as much water as we can. So techniques of mulching and growing different crops together very densely help us to achieve this effect. And on the right side, we have a field of just one crop growing, and there are no trees, there are no beneficial plants that would help other crops grow healthily. So I think this is the main difference. So the permaculture system like really harmonizes everything. Like everything has a purpose. Every action leads to a more biodiverse system. Okay, before we discuss history and origins of permaculture, I came across this footage and I've used it in my last video about holistic landscape design on YouTube. And actually, I wanted to tell you that this picture like really terrifies me. And you might be thinking, why? On one hand, we can see beautiful view mountains, some kind of pond or lake in the back, and we can see cows outside, which is a great thing because we know that animals that kept by large scale sort of farmers, and they are kept inside. They don't see in sunlight, so that should be a good thing. However, on this picture, they are eating dry grass. They don't have access to fresh, green, sort of pasture species. And that's worrying because in the past, cows used to graze among the trees, among forests. And sometimes it's really crucial for their health, especially in periods of drought. When they don't have access to sort of fresh, green feed, they need glucose to be able to digest the dry straw. And usually farmers give cows molasses or some other artificial, maybe glucose fructose syrup or something like that. But in the past, they had access to trees that had sweet pods. This way, when they ate dry fodder crop, they were able to digest brilliantly this food. So yeah, I hope the practice of grazing animals on lands of this type will change because it is totally doable to change the landscape, regenerate it, rehydrate it, and plant trees for animals so that they have shading and good feed. Okay, let's move on to history of permaculture. It is a relatively modern concept, having been developed in the 1970s by Australians Bill Mollison, the picture on the top, and David Holmgren, the picture on the bottom. And Mollison was a researcher and naturalist, and Holmgren, a designer and environmental scientist. And they were both concerned with the environmental impacts of industrial agriculture and urbanization. And they sought to create a more sustainable and holistic approach to design that would work with the natural environment rather than against it. So the term permaculture is a mixture of two words, permanent agriculture and permanent culture. And what I believe they meant by permanent culture was the permanent culture, rich culture of soil. So rich soil full of different microorganisms on a permanent basis. So always permanent soil culture. And it was coined by both Mollison and Holmgren to describe a system of agricultural and societal design that aimed to create permanent and self-sustaining settlements and food production systems. And the principles of permaculture draw from a wide range of sources, including traditional indigenous knowledge, modern ecology, and sustainable design. And Mollison and Holmgren synthesized these ideas into cohesive framework. And since the 1970s, permaculture has evolved and spread around the world as a holistic approach to sustainable living. And the next, I would like to move on to the principles of permaculture. I will really briefly go through each one of them. As you can see, we have 10 on the screen. And the first one is observe and interact. And I love this. It's about observing natural patterns and cycles of the area in which you want to grow food and work with those patterns rather than against them. For example, we would observe the sun's movement throughout the day and use that information to plan the placement of plants and structures in our gardens. Um, it's especially important for places where there is a difference of sun angles between winter season and summer season. By knowing the sun angles and the places that receive the most amount of sun rays, we can strategically place animal housing so that they benefit from extra warmth, as well as our gardens. So I love this principle. The second one is catch and store energy. So we would collect resources when they are abundant and use them during times of scarcity. For example, we would use a rainwater catchment system to collect and store rainwater to use during dry periods. The third principle is obtain a yield. So we would make sure that our design produces a yield, whether it is a food, medicine, or other resources. So we would include a variety of vegetables, fruits, and herbs that can be harvested and consumed. We could also go one step further and grow special kinds of plants that, for example, can fix nitrogen from the air. We would grow such trees and we could prune them and use their material, for example, as a mulch. And whilst decomposing, the mulch would be giving away nutrients to the soil. Okay, I think that one is straightforward. And the next principle is applying self-regulation and accepting the feedback. So we would let nature regulate the system and we would work with the feedback to make changes and improvements. For example, we would use a chicken tractor to control pests in a vegetable garden. If you don't know, a chicken tractor is a portable coop that can be moved around. It typically has some kind of wheels. So it allows chickens to forage in a specific area and eat insects and fertilize the area. And it naturally allows chickens to regulate the pest population and improve the soil health. And the gardener, in that case, would monitor the effects and make adjustments if necessary. The next principle is about using and valuing renewable resources and services. So we would use resources that are replenished naturally and value the services that natural system provides. Typical example is using solar power rather than fossil fuels for energy. But another example could be just trying to find different resources on the land that you live in and try to use those instead, for example, going to the store and buying readily made products. For example, on our land, we have found lots of stones that were left after an old part of the old stone building has collapsed. So we are trying to use them wherever we can. We also try to use used tires because they present a huge problem in our society in terms of recycling. So we collect them for free and we use them for different purposes. For example, to create a retaining walls for areas where, for example, the soil collapses. That was after like man-made excavation works that were done on our property. So yeah, I think it's a great way to use this principle. Another one is about producing no waste. So by valuing and making use of all resources, nothing goes to waste. And you might be thinking, but it's impossible to, have no waste in our kitchens. There's always a waste. However, we can create another purpose for the waste. Even if you live in a city, perhaps you could find a place that would happily accept your kitchen scraps. And typically, they would be creating a compost out of those kitchen scraps. Or if you would like to start a backyard garden, you would have a great material to add to your compost pile. The next principle is about designing from patterns to details. So we would observe patterns in nature and use that information to inform the design of the system. For example, we would arrange plants in a garden according to their specific needs and the way they interact with one another. We could also try to observe the landscape. And on the picture that you can see on the right, you can see different hills, different valleys, lower points. And we would try to use those patterns to create something beneficial. For example, we would try to foresee if we could place an earthly, for example, pond that would gather naturally rainwater. The next principle is about integrating rather than segregating. So it's about creating relationships and connections between different elements of the system rather than separating them. For example, we would integrate a variety of different plants into an agricultural system to create a diverse, self-sustaining ecosystem. And this is just an example. This is from one of my videos. We gardeners, and if you are a gardener, you are probably already like 10 steps ahead. You're probably incorporating variety of different plants, different herbs, different flowers, and their purpose is to repel, for example, pests, attract pollinators, and beneficial predators that would eat, for example, unwanted pests. However, for someone that would like to maybe slowly, incrementally change some agricultural practices, including incorporating a beneficial crop on your field is a way forward. I think it's the first step you could take. So, for example, when you prepare your soil, you plow it. And by the way, in permaculture, we believe the soil doesn't have to be dug, doesn't have to be plowed. But if that's your practice and that's what you do, you could prepare the rows of, for example, corn, if that's what you're growing. And then in between the rows that are, there you have spaces between corn. You could intercrop, you could plant a nitrogen fixer like clover. And that will already help to enrich the soil with nitrogen and help your corn to grow better. And gradually, you wouldn't have to use any pesticides. So that's just one of example that I wanted to mention here. And the next principle is using small and slow solutions. So we would start small and work slowly and incrementally to build a resilient system. For example, starting with a small, manageable permaculture garden and gradually expanding it over time. And the next principle is about using and valuing diversity. So we would create diversity in the system as diversity increases resilience and stability. For example, by including a variety of plant species in a permaculture garden to promote biodiversity and protect against pests and diseases. So as you can see, some of those principles overlap, but I love them and I love coming back to this list. And I'm really happy I can share those with you. Okay, before we discuss 5 global problems, I wanted to share with you a quote by Bill Mollison. So he said that tough problems of the world are increasingly complex, but the solutions remain embarrassingly simple. And I think the next section will clarify why that is. So we will go through 5 global problems, and I will show you how permaculture can tackle them. The first global problem we can address, even we as gardeners, is climate change. Mm, so, a way permaculture can help mitigate climate change is by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So, this can be achieved by using techniques such as composting, which turns organic waste. I wouldn't call it waste, which turns organic matter into nutrient-rich soil amendment, as well as vermiculture, which involves using worms to break down organic waste. And both practices reduce the amount of methane and carbon dioxide that would be released into the atmosphere if the waste were left to decompose in landfills. It's a huge problem, actually, in our society that the organic waste. I know that in Europe there are like attempts to collect organic waste and use it like wisely. Um, so that some recycling centers actually turn it into a compost for the use by farmers. However, still there's so much organic matter landing in landfills amongst synthetic materials and plastics. I hope this can change, and I think the more we talk about this with our friends and families, maybe the practice of using compost by our houses, maybe by our buildings, blocks of flats, would be just a normal thing. And permaculture also encourages to use renewable energy sources, such as solar and wind power, and to reduce consumption through energy efficient design and the use of locally sourced building materials. Permaculture also encourages small-scale localized food production, which reduces the carbon footprint of transportation required for conventional farming methods. And finally, permaculture offers a holistic approach to address the various aspects of climate change. And it can also be used to help communities adapt to changing climate and by creating resilient systems that can withstand extreme weather events and changes in temperature and precipitation. And I will be talking precisely about that sort of design on my next webinar, which will be on Saturday. However, this one isn't free. It costs 10 euros. So I will be showing you different sort of design approaches, techniques, and strategies that could help us better adapt to climate change and periods of drought, perhaps prevent floods in some areas. What we as gardeners can do to combat climate change is to, I think, keep doing what we're doing. That means growing food that nourishes our body and soul, and just to talk more about it amongst our families and like friends, and maybe stressing more the importance of it in our society, because I think we play a huge role. The next problem is the loss of biodiversity. What we can do, and I think most gardeners are already doing this, is we are creating diverse polycultural systems by planting a variety of different crops and integrating trees into their agricultural landscapes. This can be achieved through practices such as companion planting, agroforestry, and intercropping. So it means using native plants, which would provide habitats for native animals and insects. We would use pioneer species, so the hardy species that can first help to establish a small sort of ecosystem. And after that, we would be adding more productive species of our choice, such as fruit trees. We're also not afraid of experimenting, bringing species from parts of the world that would fit the climate. So I don't think there is another sort of niche or science that talks about biodiversity in so much detail as the permaculture does it. If you know, please let me know in the comments. Soil degradation. So permaculture practices such as composting, cover cropping, and the use of green manures can improve soil health and fertility like immensely. So composting, for example, helps to add organic matter to the soil, which can improve its structure and ability to retain moisture and water. And cover cropping involves planting crops that protect the soil. For example, you have erosion control, cover crops. Um, they also help to add nutrients to the soil and improve the soil's fertility, especially those that have abilities to fix nitrogen from the air into the soil. And we can improve soil health and fertility by using exactly those practices, so composting, cover cropping, and green manure, and minimizing the soil disturbance through no-till and no-dig gardening techniques. Water scarcity, that's a big one. So permaculture designers look at the water sort of problems, issues, as a very first step to designing a landscape, a backyard, whatever that is. Because it's really important to capture it, store it, and use it efficiently, and also in ways that mimic natural water cycles. So we would harvest rainwater, we would store it either in water tanks or in ponds, irrigation ponds. We could use swales, which are ditches, however, uncompacted ones, and allow the water to slowly be spread across the landscape. And the swales are actually a tree growing system. So you would normally have a tree on the other side on a mound created out of the soil that was taken to create that ditch. And I think I will make this month a video about swales because they are super important. So we would create forest gardens. And actually, the reason why it's important is that trees help to regulate those processes. It's been proven that actually over the forests, there is a bigger precipitation. So whenever the trees are cut and the forest is gone, slowly, we unfortunately face desertification, and it already happens in South Spain, unfortunately. So we would always promote the use of trees in our gardens and creating food forests. We would also use wetlands, not necessarily by getting rid of the water from that area. We could still use wetlands to grow food. And this is what actually Aztecs have been doing. They've been using a system called Chinampa. They were using area that was sort of flooded with rainwater in raining sort of season. And they were using the soil mounds on top of that water to create a garden beds, a raised sort of garden beds. They were also using floating garden beds, and it was the most productive agricultural system in the world. And I think we can learn a lot from them. And I think permaculture is the first sort of niche that mentions that. So I'm extremely grateful. I was exposed to that, and I think now it is my duty to share that knowledge with you. So to recap, we can we can capture, store, and use water efficiently by using rainwater harvesting systems, planting trees, vegetating sort of landscapes that can help increase the amount of water in an area. And we can also use drought-tolerant plants and use mulch to retain soil moisture that can reduce the need for irrigation. And the last global problem is the hunger and malnutrition. Permaculture can be used to create sustainable food systems that provide a diverse range of nutrient-dense food that can be productive even in challenging environments. This can be achieved through practices such as agroforestry, which involves integrating trees into agricultural landscapes, and also to provide a range of food and non-food products, and the use of companion planting, which allows different crops to be grown together in ways that support each other's growth and increase yields. Additionally, the special permaculture design helps to reduce the dependence on external inputs such as fertilizers, pesticides, energy-intensive irrigation systems, and can produce food on a small and local scale. And if you're interested in that, I highly recommend you to check out Jeff Lawton's project, which is called the Greening the Desert Project. Greening the Desert Project. So what he did, he bought a land in Jordan, in the Dead Sea Valley, so in a place that is 400 meters below the sea level, in a desert, absolutely no vegetation, the worst conditions you can ever imagine, and somehow he was able to create an oasis there. He grows Mediterranean and tropical types of fruit trees, vegetables. He has the chickens and like rabbits and other animals helped to return sort of organic matter to the soil, but he was doing this gradually. It took a few years to do this, but he achieved it, and I think it's incredible, and it should be around the news. So highly recommend you to check this out if you haven't already. I think what we've learned is that gardening promotes growing a wide variety of nutrient sort of dense foods, vegetables, fruits, herbs, berries, fodder crops. And by using different gardening practices, it is possible to increase crop yields, reduce the dependence on fertilizers. I shouldn't even mention pesticides because that should be a huge no-no. And we could produce food on a small scale, which reduces the carbon footprint. So permaculture is a way of creating gardens and farms that are good for the environment and good for people living near it. Let me have a look if there are any comments. No comments. If you're going to watch this later, if any question pops into your head, feel free to, send a comment, send questions. You can contact me as well. My website is granvisio.com. So you can find my contact details over there. You can you can fill out the contact form, or you can call me. I really don't mind. If you have questions about your site, perhaps, or like anything, I'm really, really happy to help. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you. And I will see you in the next live stream. I hope I will see you next time.